the battles of 1862. Give a quick, brief summary of the couple of most important,
Yes.
And with the import, one way or the other, for the rest of the war.
Yeah. Well,
You just talked about it.
I talked about Antietam. I'll come back to that a little bit. One of the most important campaigns of the war is really underemphasized, I think, in history, and it's Ulysses Grant's River Campaign of February 1862. It's the most efficient, effective campaign of the war. In 2 weeks, leading an army that is initially about 17,000 men, Grant moves up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, captures Fort Donelson in mid-February, and the consequences of that include the surrender of an entire Confederate army, the fall of Nashville, which the war historian Herman Hathaway has called the biggest supply disaster of the entire war, the capture and destruction of the second largest iron works in the Confederacy. The entire Confederate line falls out of Kentucky, out of Missouri, and out of most of Tennessee, all the way down. You have Union gunboats going clear into Alabama, all in 2 weeks. That was a huge shot in the arm for Lincoln, because it looked at that time like the Union was not moving, was completely stuck in the mud, and suddenly this enormous victory created a sense of overconfidence, which collapsed a couple of months later, first weekend of April, at in southern Tennessee, near a church called Shiloh. More Americans killed in 2 days, Daniel, as you know, than in all of America's wars put together. That was the weekend that the Civil War became a cataclysm, that people began to digest. As Grant says, up until that point, he had thought that a couple of quick victories would end the war. That's when he realized that total conquest would be required.
So it brought Grant to the fore, of course. He got his moniker of Unconditional
Unconditional
Surrender right in front
Grant.
of his bunkmate from Mexico, Buckner, and
Simon Bolivar Buckner.
who didn't talk to him for years after that. But then they really didn't. He thought they were friends, and here, unconditional surrender.
Right.
I'm your friend. Here's my sword, and
Yes.
And but they reconciled because he helped carry Grant's casket.
That's right. They ultimately did, and that was one of the big symbols of reconciliation for the nation in the post-war period. But then you have the 7 days battles outside Richmond, which is terrible carnage, and then the Battle of Second Bull Run, Second Manassas in late August, which is perhaps the low point for the Union effort, where one set of Union generals refused to go to the aid of another general who's locked in battle, followed by Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, Perryville in October, and then the horrible Battle of Fredericksburg in December, mid-December, and then this often forgotten little battle that starts on New Year's Eve, 1862, outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where horribly bloody, hot battle, ultimately a Union victory. And Lincoln writes to Rosecrans, the Union general, several months later, "I will never forget that battle at Stones River, because if you hadn't given us a victory, I'm not sure we could have survived."
I'm going to ask something that you say in the prologue. You call the Confederacy at the beginning of '62, and I'll quote, "now a powerful country in its own right," unquote. So do you have a different view than Lincoln did? Because he didn't see that as a country. I'm just kind of curious.
I'm summarizing the view largely there of the rest of the world. Lord Palmerston, 77-year-old Prime Minister of Great Britain, who had seen everything in a 50-plus year career in the leadership of the most powerful nation on earth, advised his foreign ministry around the end of 1861 that it was almost certain that the North could not subdue the South. Later in that year, William Gladstone famously said they've made an army, they've made a navy, and more importantly, they've made a country, they've made a nation. In 1862, the world was coming to view the Confederate States of America as a country. And Lincoln's persistent insistence that it wasn't was maddening. The French Emperor, Louis Napoleon, at one point almost gets angry at the American ambassador, William Dayton, who keeps saying that they could potentially win. And he jabs his finger at the huge, empty mass of real estate in the center of the South, a territory larger than all of Europe conquered by his uncle, Napoleon, and says, they'll go there. You can't defeat them, they'll go there. So in that sense, it was a country.
Sam in Rowlett, Texas, we thank you, Sam, for this question. Did Lincoln have political operatives in Kentucky and or Maryland trying to encourage support for the Union?
Oh, absolutely. Lincoln, from the very...
James Spader, was he there?
In Kentucky, which Lincoln in many ways viewed as home, he had his lifelong best friend, to the extent that Lincoln had any friends. Joshua Speed certainly was one. And in the early days of the war in particular, Speed and others in Kentucky cooperated with Lincoln in smuggling muskets into Kentucky so that Loyalists would be as well armed as the pro-Confederacy forces there. And hardly a week went by that Lincoln wasn't meeting with or having conversations with Loyalists in Kentucky. There were some very colorful ones. Cassius Marcellus Clay, the great abolitionist and duel fighter who ultimately ended his life building himself a castle and complete with cannons to defend himself against his imagined enemies. Was a great force in Kentucky.
We just brought in a copy. Here's a collectible artifact that came in that we just got a copy of his memoir.
Is that right?
Only volume 1. Volume 2 was never published. Signed by him, which you don't see very often.
Really?
So that was kind of nice to have. I'm glad you mentioned him for everyone here. So many things I want to go into, actually. Let me ask this first. About colonization. We were at the Lincoln Forum, and you were on this last November, and you were dragged onto a panel about that and other things of consequence for 62. Edna Medford, for one, criticized Lincoln for holding on to the course of possible colonization too long. Personally, I think Lincoln had a great concern that the two races, after all this time and what their past was, could they live together?
Yes.
Really in peace? And we're getting closer to that answer. Hopefully, yes, but it's still a bumpy road, I think. So, what are your thoughts about colonization, imbroglio in today's historical talk?
Well, I refer to colonization at the end of the book as Lincoln's worst idea. It was not an idea that he pioneered. It was an idea that he absorbed from his original political idol, Henry Clay. And it was a response to this notion that the two races had, that the slavery problem, in addition to the humane question, it had unnaturally put two races together that didn't belong together, and that it would be better not just for the white race but for the blacks as well to be separate, and all kinds of cockamamie science involved in that, along with the prejudice and along with the lack of vision, along with the history of the Haitian Revolution, which, in the great words of the wonderful historian of slavery, David Bryan Davis, hung over antebellum America like a bloody shroud. The idea that if the African Americans were free, they'd rise up and kill their white oppressors. All of this went to the idea that somehow couldn't it be possible just to undo this mistake and separate? And of course, that was not possible, and not right, and not desirable.
And Lincoln learned through this.
I think Lincoln
well.
did. I think Eric Foner's wonderful book from last year, The Fiery Trial, makes such a strong argument for the idea of Lincoln's growth and progress on the issue of race, that it's not a static issue, it's a moving target, and I think that's exactly right.
Let's talk about Lincoln a little bit. At the beginning, you say that he was seen as feckless and inadequate. Mm-hmm. What voices were speaking in that tone?
The book begins, in a way, with New Year's Eve, 1861, the last hours of the previous year ticking away, and Congress has just come back to find the Union war effort in complete disarray. They've created a joint committee on the conduct of the war to get to the bottom of the failure of the Lincoln administration, and on New Year's Eve they convene their first fact-finding mission with Lincoln and his cabinet, and for over an hour and a half there's this hostile interrogation of the president, over the course of which it dawns on the cabinet, on the Congressional Committee, that Lincoln has really no idea what is planned for the Union armies that are now collected in numbers over 250,000 across the country. George McClellan, the General-in-Chief, has frozen him out of the planning. What's more, McClellan that night was rumored to be dying of typhoid fever. This lack of leadership, vacuum of leadership, was so appalling that Edward Bates, the Attorney General, goes home after the meeting and sits up into the night, writing page after page in his diary, describing this horrible scene. And he comes to the conclusion that Lincoln is a man of character, honest, in the main, wise. I like the in the main is, but I fear he lacks the power to command. This was a friend. This was a favorable assessment, that he was just in over his head, and in many people believed that anyone would be over his head, because there was also this there was a great crisis in confidence in the idea of elected government, period, at the time. You have to remember that.
Sounds familiar.
Yes, but we have the example of Lincoln's success to look at. They had no example from history of a republic of elected leaders surviving a crisis the scale of the Civil War. Rome had its Caesar, France had its Napoleon, and they thought that the United States would need a dictator as well. And so there was a lot of talk about military coups and so forth.
I'm going to get away from this for a second. Do we have a crisis in the Republic today? I mean, here we are, and you talk about the movie, we could maybe get to that later, but that was touted as compromise, yet it wasn't. It was also, the yang of it was that there was no compromise. Lincoln would not go beyond a certain point.
Right.
And he expected to have what he needed done, and it was. But he wouldn't compromise on the slavery issue.
No.
That Seward perhaps was trying to press a little bit on him, and many others too. So if we look back on Lincoln and have that example of not compromising on a principle that you think is so important, can the Tea Partiers today, I don't want to get into politics too much, say the same thing? Here is our principle, and we're not compromising just like Lincoln didn't. And we feel that this is how we have to go forward.
Right.
Civil war be damned. Secession be damned me.
That's an excellent question, and it gets to Lincoln's genius as a politician, because there's a very important difference there, Dan. Lincoln of 1865, when he ruled out the possibility of compromising the slave issue in order to get a negotiated peace, had already gone through being the Lincoln of 1861, who said in his inaugural address that there's no reason why we can't come right back together and go on as before. The Lincoln of early 1862, or really the whole year of 1862, he held out and desperately worked for a gradual and compensated emancipation that would pay the slave owners for their quote-unquote property, that would play out over the course of a generation or more, that would fall, as he put it, as gently as the dews from heaven. And then finally, the argument for military emancipation, which was only a partial freeing of the slaves, did not touch the slaves who were held in the loyal border states, famously, or even in loyal counties in the South. He had brought the Northern public through all those steps along with him. Not everybody, it was never unanimous, but he built a majority. They looked at him, they saw him try every step short of the hard and fast line. And that's why I believe they supported him when he drew the hard and fast line, because he tried everything else.